Hi, I am ArtsByKev, and welcome to another BLOCKBENCH tutorial. And in this video, we will take a look at how this mecha Wither Storm has been built up. Yeah, I know, it doesn't necessarily look too much like the Wither Storm from the original game. This is one of my own interpretations that I made a while back on the main channel. If you haven't seen that video, you can go and check out the link that is probably going to pop up here or in the description below. Alright, let's get started. The mecha Wither Storm was actually not built like this originally. This is the final stages when everything has been put together. Let's go back in time a bit to a previous version that I have located up here. This is more so what a Wither Storm looks like in production, and I'm gonna start from here as we delve into how this thing is built up, because of a few fundamental rules that I follow and apply as I work on building models. The first rule is to not build everything. I usually build whatever is necessary, and then if I know that I'm gonna copy something over, I could just have the same design for it. I won't build that second part. I'll just build one of them, and when everything is done, then I copy it over to the other side. If you are working in a generic project, you can have as many textures as you like. But if you're packaging for example, bedrock, you may want to make sure that there's only one texture when you're done. And the way you do that is by selecting all of the textures. No, actually, that's not how it's done. But people do believe this is usually the way. The way you do it is by selecting all of the model, not the textures. And then you create a new texture. And that's going to then take everything that is currently being textured on your model and apply that to one new cohesive texture. If we click there and I just confirm, down here at the bottom I now have a texture that is 4096 by 4096. You can barely see it behind my head there. And all of these other textures are no longer part of the model. Look at that, I can take them out and this one texture is now here. Doing that in your workflow is going to make things a lot easier moving up ahead. Our model can be stripped into several different pieces. If we look over here in the outliner, all of these folders are different parts of our body. They're created with this button over here, add group it says. There's a big difference between cubes and folders. The folders, or bones as we refer to them, are collecting a bunch of different cubes below them. Like the jaw, for example. This jaw consists of all of these different teeth and the shape that goes around here and the stems that reaches up to connect to the head. And adding all of the cubes underneath one bone allows us to move them from the bone origin. And you need the bones to animate your model, which we're gonna get to in a second. When we have cubes in a bone, the bone controls what happens to the cubes, but you have to click on this bone specifically and make sure that it's selected everything below it, for it to actually manipulate all of the elements when you move them around. When you are building your model, you want to try to focus on a few individual components at all times. First, build one piece and then use that as a measurement for the rest of the model to be carried out from. When I built the jaw, that would then dictate most part of whatever the head was going to be like. And if I built the head first, then that would dictate how big the jaw could be, or at least figuratively, because you can design things whatever way you like. There is no right or wrong in this. Remember that. The eye itself is one simple little bone and this one little cube right here, which allows me to move it around, for example, like this, so that the Wither Storm can look in different ways with that one eye on that one head. And the Wither Storm has several heads. This head up here is the same as the head down here. The only difference is it doesn't have a jaw. So if I hide this jaw, you will see that they are practically the same. The only difference is this one has this extra hinge joint point for the jaw to connect to, visually. As you notice here, just up by the desk, we have this extended head. There are going to be 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these ones are then stacked neck elements that sit on one another before the actual head itself comes. And if we take a quick look at these by looking at the pivot, you'll notice that the first pivot is located at the very bottom of that neck component. So this piece itself here would represent the lower part of the neck. Then the next part has its pivot from here. The next part has its pivot from here, and so on, all the way up to that head, which then connects onto this joint right here. Building the elements like that and moving the pivot to a great location is going to be mandatory for you to be able to do these types of bendy motions. Generally, for tentacle shapes, it's pretty good to have the pivot always in the center of the bone below. There's a lot more I can say about pivots and how to think about the joints of a model, because whatever the joint is like is going to dictate the way you want to animate it. If this was an enclosed kneecap on a robot, it would only ever move in these directions. Up and down, open and stretch, and then fold. But if we look at the way that I designed this joint, you can kind of imagine that it would be able to rotate to about here and rotate to about here. If it rotates further, it's going to start clipping into this object. Clipping is the term for when something is bending into a different shape in a way that it wouldn't physically be able to do otherwise. If this shape was a solid and this shape was a solid, there's no way they would be able to interact like this. And if I just follow the rules of non-clipping, you'll still see that I have a pretty good amount of motion with the way that I designed this joint. Like now the head is looking that direction, and if we undo that, it's looking this direction, from here to here, while still following how much we could actually be allowed to move visually by the way it's been visually designed. But as you know, this is animation and it's digital, so there is nothing that limits us from doing something like this. But yeah, try to avoid that. Alright, let's take a look at the tentacle. Here we have the big tentacle. The big tentacle consists of several individual pieces that stems one from one another, the same way as the neck did, all the way out till we get to these grippers. I never animated these grippers or had the intention to do that because this was a showpiece model, but if I wanted to, these all would have been their own separate bones, which I could rotate from a pivot that I would have designated to a central point here to open and close the grippers. But as I said, in this case, I didn't. There's something familiar about most of these pieces along the way, from the outer to the inner element. A lot of these elements are just copies. All of these, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, are just straight copies of one another. This has to do with something that I expect a lot of beginner modelers don't know about. Optimization. Why should I make one by one if I can copy some, since I don't need all of them to look unique? That's an important technique that you add to your own workflow. Try to be a bit efficient. There is no reason to give yourself more labor than you need to. But as you will notice, there is a vague difference to some of these just by size, all the way out to the end, because I wanted them to taper off as they got closer to the grippers. Let's take a look at this lower center. Now you ask yourself, okay, so you have a lower shield front and a lower shield back, why do you have a lower center bone? Well, this has to do with the way that I wanted to animate this model. I knew from the start that I wanted these shields to rotate around the base of the model. You'll notice that we have 4 individual shields that all rotate around. The way this is done is that 2 of these shields together have their bones connected to a master bone. You will notice that this shield right here has its pivot here. And this shield over here has its pivot there. If I wanted to rotate them around the center, that would be a lot of work to compensate for. So what I do is that I put them into a secondary bone, a master bone if you will, that has its pivot in the very center of the model. That way I can move these 2 individual shields together with the main bone and then also still do their individual motions. If I remove the rotation here for an example, you'll notice that the way that these shields are animated, they are tilting slightly back and forth. And that is done on the individual shields, as you notice by these keyframes down here. If I now paste back the rotation, they'll spin together on the same distance from the center, because as you notice by the pivot, that pivot is centered, and that rotates around, this way of course, on these 2 layers. And if you pay some really close attention, you'll notice that I've actually used 8 of these shields. 1 here, 4 down there, another one there, another one here, and another one there. The only difference is, on these upper shields I have runes on the center sides, and here on the back as well. So these are just flip copies of one another, and these down below here had this side copied to that side, and these cubes removed before being copied into place. So there is a lot of copy pasting when you're building large models. I can't stress this enough. Why do more than you have to? If we take a close look at these discs, you'll also notice that this has a symmetrical pattern to it. Can you guess how it was made? Correct! I first made this element here. These cubes stacked together, and I had a pivot in the center, and then I just copied that piece and rotated it to the side to get this side, and then again to get this one, and copy it again to get this one, all the way around until I got a circle. And then it's just a matter of mishing and mashing and trying to get these to line up properly. Most of this model is a pretty significant symmetrical piece. You can even see how I utilize the fact that these are shadowed and hidden to create the same thing on the backhand side, as if there could be more heads added here and here, looking at it visually. But the truth is, I just didn't want to have to texture everything twice with different looks. So what I did was, I left it be the same underneath here as here, and just added a texture to that hidden zone in the front, so that it looked like something could connect to it here on the back. If we go back to the previous version of this model, we have all of these individual textures as I mentioned before. They do tell a bit of a story as to how I progressed while working on this model. Usually, I just make one texture and I make all of the texture once the model has been completed. But as I was building this model, I wasn't certain to what I wanted it to look like, and there were a few different iterations. So whatever I felt I was done with, I wanted to complete the texture of as well and use for reference while building the rest, so that I could adjust my workflow to get it looking the way I wanted, step by feeling it in with the things I already had completed. Otherwise you would have to be super creative at the moment of completion. If I select these and hide them, you'll notice that there is a big amount of non-texture area right here. Ugh, look at that. Unfinished model. Ugh. I usually try to clean things up, which I have done on the MECHA Storm that was exported, but this is the build version, so this is kind of what it looks like. A lot of hidden faces that you clean up afterwards. These sides and these fill-in areas weren't considered when I was first making the disc. They were something I came back to finish off later, and thus they had their own texture applied once I was working on them at that point in time. Now I do want to share a little bit about the animation with you, something that might be a bit of an eye-opener for some, and something that others will probably already know all about. As you notice, this is a 12-second animation. The reason to why it's so long is because I want it to move enough for it to not look too repeating. And I also want to make sure that once it's looping, it has done a significant amount of different motions so that your eyes aren't catching the loop instantly. And if you're just paying attention to this one, yeah, you probably notice that there is indeed an animation loop going on, that it does the same motion over and over, but the amount of motion is significant enough for it not to be super obvious. If I were to put this inside of a game engine like Unity, I might even do it in such a way that all of these individual arms and bones are animated in separate animations, and then I would have different scripts controlling when they would play, how long they would play for, how fast they would play, so that the looping would be even less noticeable. Yes, every individual bone would have a loop that you could probably notice, but the total motion would be so diverse that you couldn't. And this animation itself is just an idle that is meant for the showcase, meaning that since I knew I was going to have different camera shots showing off different pieces of the body at different points in time, it never needed to be too complex, or too correct even for that matter. The goal was to make sure that it could showcase the idea, and the main target for my attention was actually the heads, as you notice with the different eyes moving around, that I later connected lights to get these cool beams going. I'll see if I can get a clip and share here. As a lot of you probably already noticed by taking a look at these individual parts, they are moving back and forth in place. Together they look very dynamic and living, but the truth of the matter is, it is one thing to make this arm move in a smooth pattern and make it loop in a visually pleasing way. For those of you who are beginners, just trust my words, it is a lot of work and a lot of considerations. Let's hide a few parts of the body to really showcase what I'm talking all about. Let's take a look at this arm and the way that it loops. You notice that it moved back and forth? That in and of itself would look really repetitive after some time, even if it's a 12-second loop. Since it doesn't do anything else, your eyes are gonna catch that at some point. And after some time, you will definitely start noticing this repeating pattern. If this model was moving around, it wouldn't be as noticeable, but in this case it's very noticeable because we're only looking at this one arm at this point in time and whatever it does motion-wise. But if this is the only thing that this animation does, you may want to consider doing something more to it. If I activate another tentacle, these two now do their loops. The loop from the start, they sort of do the same thing, move in and move out. I've offset the motion so they do slightly different things. And on their own, they may look repetitive, but together they start to look a little bit more interesting. Now if we add another tentacle, the one here on the back, even though the motion isn't complex or difficult or anything, it is when it's all combined you start to really see the effects of it. And this is the big challenge when animating large objects, and especially things that has tentacles in general, or just complex models all throughout. You want to find the perfect balance between enough motion, enough interesting motion, and also how long a loop needs to be for it not to look repeating, and also how many other motions are taking part at the same time, and what dictates the attention of the person watching. Right now you're looking at the tentacles because I told you to do so, but in the full presentation of this model there's a lot going on. Also consider the addition of the beams that I spoke about. Your eyes simply won't get stagnant looking at something specifically, because there's too much currently grabbing your attention, which in this case allowed me to get away with doing a lot simpler motion all throughout, than to be complex and very finicky with all of the intricate details. Now with that said, if you are a beginner, there's probably a lot of information that just went over your head. But you can always return to this video in the future as you're learning and pick up on some of the tips that I shared, some of the details as to how this model was made, and I would love to see the stuff that you make. So feel free to join the community Discord link down below. If you want to support the channels, head over to Patreon. If you enjoy the format of this video, then let me know in the comments down below. Leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you around in the next one.